Hello, and welcome to another episode of Over My Dead Pod. I am your host for today, Kate Carter,
I'm Kylie Colwell.
And I'm Holly Spear.
and let's dig right in, ladies. I think you guys are going to enjoy this one. It's a classic Kate story,
We better enjoy it.
but it's not a cult, so I will throw that in. In 1989, Jo Rogers was thrilled that she was finally able to take her two daughters on their first ever family vacation outside of their home state of Ohio. But the road trip they had planned to Florida quickly became an unthinkable nightmare after the family came face to face with a serial killer. Okay, so there's three women in the story that we're going to talk about. It's going to revolve around that. Those names are Jo, which is the mom, Michelle and Christie. Michelle and Christie are the daughters. I'm going to say it a million times so you'll get used to it. So let's dive right into their backgrounds. Jo Hetzler was born on November 12th, 1952 in Van Wert, Ohio, which is a really small farming town on the border of Ohio and Indiana. And she grew up on the family farm. She had a pretty normal childhood. She was a happy girl, outgoing, just overall fun person. So when she was in high school, she began dating a classmate named Hal Rogers. Only a few short months after their graduation, the two of them got engaged, and Jo quickly became pregnant with their first daughter. Kind of sad. When Jo and Hal got married, Jo's mom was so embarrassed that her daughter had gotten pregnant out of wedlock that she didn't allow Jo to wear a wedding dress, and she didn't allow her to invite any friends to her wedding.
Aw, that's sad.
But Jo being Jo, she made the best out of every situation and didn't let it bother her on her wedding day. She was just happy to be able to marry Hal. So on February 22nd, 1972, Jo gave birth to their first daughter, Michelle. And then about 7 years later, the couple gave birth to a second daughter named Christie. The Rogers family lived on a 300-acre dairy farm in a small town right next to Van Wert, and it was called Wilshire in Ohio. As you can imagine with a dairy farm, especially one of this size, because 300 acres is huge. Well, at least I find that huge. I don't know if that's big for a dairy farm, but I think that's a lot of land.
Sure sounds like it.
The Rogers stayed busy pretty much every day. The cows needed to be milked every day, twice a day, regardless of circumstances or weather, 5:30 a.m. and 3 p.m. Both daughters, Michelle and Christie, would help their parents out with the daily chores, and they also were able to balance their schoolwork and extracurricular activities. Imagine never having a day off. I think about that with like farmers.
I'm so glad I did not grow up on a farm.
I would have loved it, but now I think like how would you have a baby go at 5:30 to milk cows? I mean, they do it, so kudos to them. So the first daughter, Michelle, at this point in our story, she's now 17, towards the end of her high school career. She was a quiet girl. She would spend her mornings in the farm milk room before she headed to school. She was like this typical farm girl. She was known to be a tomboy. She would even sometimes sleep in the barn with what she called her cows. Even though Michelle was this tomboy, she always would keep a little bit of pink on her. And she was known to wear these really cute pink rimmed glasses, even though she didn't need a prescription. As for the younger daughter, Christie, in our story, she's now 14. She was definitely a daddy's girl. She had named all of the cows on the farm and would often be caught outside practicing her cheerleading routines to them. But Christie was also an athlete and played on her school's softball team. The eldest daughter, Michelle, was more reserved, and the youngest daughter, Christie, was more outgoing, which I kind of feel like is the norm.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
As for Jo and Hal, they would work side by side on the farm together during the days. And then at night, Jo would head off to her second job at the local food warehouse in town, and she was a forklift operator. And the reason that Jo got this second job is because she was then able to qualify her family for health insurance, which she obviously didn't have owning her own dairy farm, which is like, kudos to you, Jo. That's too much work. So her day-to-day schedule was really tough and she was constantly tired, but Jo pushed on knowing that she was able to help her daughters up for success. 1988, problems in the Rogers home began to make their life a little bit harder. Hal and his brother John were the actual owners of the dairy farm, and people in town always thought that John was like kind of a weirdo. He lived in a trailer on the Rogers farm with his girlfriend, but when the two of them broke up, the girlfriend continued to live in the trailer. One day, in May of 1988, when she came home from work one night and was threatened by a man in a mask with a knife. The man held the knife up to her throat and sexually assaulted her. And the whole time he videotaped this attack. John's ex-girlfriend called the police and told them that she thought the attacker was actually John himself. So like she's getting sexually attacked, like she's getting raped basically. And
Right.
the whole time she knows it's John. Once the police were able to obtain a warrant for the trailer, they went and found evidence that they needed. It was that video that John sexually assaulted his girlfriend that he was taping the whole time. But to make things even worse, the police also find explicit photographs of Michelle.
Oh.
Apparently, for the past 2 years, John had been sexually assaulting his niece and taking pictures every time he assaulted her. Once the police talked to Michelle and her parents, Michelle was able to confirm that the assaults had been taking place and that John had threatened to kill her if she had said anything. And of course, as any parent would be, Joe and Hal were absolutely devastated to find this all out, as they felt guilty that these things were happening in their own home, basically, like on the farmland. Once John was publicly accused of the assaults, he claimed that he was somehow being framed for all of it, though there was photo evidence, and he had denied all of the abuse.
You can't claim you're being framed when it's filmed.
Right. But get this, what's even more mind-blowing, which like makes me really sad too, is that John and Hal's mom, like the grandmother in this situation, believed John. The grandmother even went as far as to go to the media and tell everyone that Michelle, the 17-year-old, was a liar and making up the assaults. Because she believed John, Hal felt as if he had no decision but to cut his mother out of his life and his family's life. Of course, that was a really hard thing to do, and it mentally and physically took a toll on Hal's life. He eventually went into a dark depression that he really wasn't able to get out of. Both Hal and his daughter, Michelle, refused to go to therapy. I know a lot of people like that. And more so, they just wanted everything to go away and never talk about it again, just sweeping it under the rug. Eventually, John was charged and convicted, and he was sentenced to 7 to 25 years for the assault of his ex-girlfriend. But Michelle didn't want to go in court and testify, so all of the charges against John for Michelle's assaults were like dropped.
But they had photo evidence.
Makes no sense, but that just sucks so much because she's 17. Well, like she doesn't want to publicly go and say that, and so they just dropped the charges. After the trial, Michelle tried her best to just get back to her normal, regular teenage life. She started doing really well academically. She joined multiple clubs to keep busy, and she even began dating a classmate named Jeff. Michelle was really proud of their relationship, but on May 25th, 1989, unknown to Jeff, he would be saying goodbye to his girlfriend, Michelle, and then never see her again. Michelle, Christie, and their mom, Joe, were heading off for a road trip to Florida for a family vacation. It was quite a big deal because 3 of the 4 Roger family members were going on this getaway. And if you can imagine, it was almost impossible for them to ever spend any days away from the farm. And because of that, Hal Rogers decided to stay back and attend to the dairy farm. This vacation was also an important one because this would be the first time that Michelle and Christie would ever leave the state of Ohio.
Oh, wow.
Oh my God.
So on May 26, 1989, the 3 women packed up their blue 1986 Oldsmobile and said goodbye to Daddy Hal as they left for their 14-hour-long road trip from Ohio to Florida. Joe, who absolutely loved driving, but tended to drive a little too fast, was anxious about getting the girls to Florida, so everyone hopped in the car and she booked it to Interstate 75. May 30th, the girls arrived in Jacksonville, Florida, where they immediately headed off to the Jacksonville Zoo the following morning. The following day, they headed to SeaWorld and MGM Studios. So these girls like really packed in their vacation. I mean, having never left the state, there's a lot of things to do in Florida. They were doing it all. And then on June 1st, the women drove to Tampa, Florida to visit Busch Gardens and eventually made their way to the beach to chill out for a bit and relax. Around 12:30 p.m. the day that the ladies checked into their hotel, it was a day's inn at Rocky Point, and around 7 minutes later, Michelle called her boyfriend Jeff to wish him a happy birthday and update him on their Florida adventures. Michelle's call to Jeff lasted around 10 minutes. Afterwards, the ladies all headed to the beach, and around 12:57 p.m., one of them called the Busch Gardens information line. No one knows what the women did after the beach, but according to their disposable camera, they didn't end up going to Busch Gardens after all. Later that night, the women ate dinner at the local restaurant at the hotel, and later on, a businessman would come forward and say that he remembered seeing the girls who seemed to be enjoying themselves, and that one of them had said hi to him as they were leaving the restaurant after their meal. The last photo that was found on the disposable camera was that of the sunset night from the balcony of their hotel room. The 3 women quickly jumped into their car and headed out to take more pictures of the sunset. And from there, the 3 Rogers women would never be seen alive again. Now I'm going to jump forward a few days. The last time that the women were seen was on June 1st. We're now on June 4th. Daddy Hal Rogers was waiting for the girls' arrival back in Ohio, as Mom Jo promised that they were going to be home that night. But Hal was kind of nervous because he hadn't heard from any of them in a few days, and they should have made it home by now because Jo was supposed to go to work the next day and Michelle was supposed to start summer school. Hal waited and waited, but there were no signs of the girls.
Would you wait to see if they came home, or would you report them missing?
See, I talked to them the night before, they're driving home today, and I hadn't heard from them all day, and they're a little late getting back. I don't think I would be worried.
Right.
That's 3
Right.
days.
But after 3 days,
That second day, I would be like, what? Okay, something's going on, you know?
I don't think I would call the police straight away. I would call like the hotel or something, maybe.
Yeah, fair.
Hal also agrees with you ladies because for those 3 days that he hadn't heard from his family members, he began calling around to family and friends, but everyone kept telling him that no one had heard from them. Meanwhile, on the same day down in Florida, a sailboat called the Amber Waves was returning to Tampa from a trip from the Keys. As the sailboat crossed under the Sunshine Skyway Bridge in Tampa Bay, some of its passengers noticed something strange floating in the water. Once close, the passengers were able to say that it was a woman's body. She was face down and naked. The body's arms and feet were tied together with yellow rope. Immediately, the boat called the Coast Guard, who sent a rescue boat to their location. And when the Coast Guard tried to retrieve the body, they were unable to do so at first because the rope that was tied around the body's arms and feet was also tied to something heavy in the water. So they cut the ropes and placed the woman's body in a body bag and headed for the mainland. On the way there, the Coast Guard received another call. Another body had been spotted. It was a second female body floating in the bay. The same crew was able to locate the second body. It was also found naked from the waist down, bound with yellow rope and tied to something heavy in the water. The Coast Guard were cutting the ropes from the second body when another call came in. Less than a few hundred yards away, someone had spotted a third female body. At this point, the police were waiting at the dock when the Coast Guard made its return with all three bodies on board. The police photographed and examined the bodies, which were already in the process of decomposition. It was found that the heavy thing in the water that all the bodies were tied to were concrete blocks.
You know, those Coast Guards and all those people are like, what the hell is going on?
Yeah, they may get like a couple bodies a year, not 3 in one day.
Yeah.
Probably like within 2 hours too, you know?
Yeah.
Like the Coast Guard never they weren't able to get back to shore before the other calls came in. Not to mention, on all of the bodies, the mouths had been taped shut. From what it seems, only one of the women had managed to free one of her arms before she had died. Just from the sheer fact that the women were naked from the waist down, it was also assumed that they had all been sexually assaulted. But the police were unable to find any identification on the bodies and were unable to determine exactly how the women died until the autopsies were done. Back in Ohio, Daddy Hal had not seen or heard from his family, so he called the police and reported them missing. But with no word from anyone, including the police, on June 7th, which is a long time after the girls went missing, Hal drove to the local bank, withdrew $7,000, and decided he was going to head to Florida to start his own investigation. But the next day, on June 8th, the housekeeper back at the Days Inn in Tampa was starting to get a little worried about hotel room 251. She remembered that 3 women had checked into this room about a week ago, but the housekeeper noticed that every day when she went into the room to clean and fix the sheets, the beds weren't being slept in, and all of the women's belongings were exactly in the same spots. This housekeeper, who trusted her gut, decided to tell her manager to call the police. Once the police arrived, they dusted the room for fingerprints and evidence, and it was then that the police were able to identify the 3 bodies found floating in the Tampa Bay. Those bodies were of Jo, Michelle, and Christie Rogers.
They weren't concerned when they didn't like check out.
I was going to say that too.
Oh, yeah, I didn't think about that. I don't know. Maybe back then, like people,
You just stayed and paid when you
after.
left.
Yeah.
I don't know, old people chime in.
Yeah. Come
Yeah.
on, let us know.
I mean, it could just be like that kind of hotel too, you know, like I don't know, or resort or wherever they were staying, you know.
So on the same day that the bodies were identified, the police in Ohio were contacted and told the news. The police then arrived at the Roger farm not too long after and told Hal what had been discovered. Back in Florida, the police had found the Rogers family car, which was parked on a boat ramp on the Courtney Campbell Causeway, which is a highway that connects the towns of Tampa and Clearwater. Like you have to go over it. Where the car was located was in an area that people tended to pull off the highway to hang out. There was like this small strip of beach, so you could like fish, you could launch your boats from there, but no one knew why the car was there. Inside of the car was all of the Rogers women's belongings, and located on the driver's seat was a note that had handwritten directions on it by Joe. On the directions, they found the route from the hotel to where the car was found. And on the same piece of paper, there was also a note that said Blue W/WHT. The police quickly determined that this note meant blue-white, which was what they then determined to be the boat color that lured the women out of their hotel room. Which, like, okay, when I read that, I was like, how did they Blue W/WHT? Hey, did you automatically think blue-white?
I think that's what the shorthand is. Blue with white.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, so tell me what you mean lured them out of their hotel room.
Yeah, how did they reach that assumption?
I don't know. Yeah. And they also immediately were like blue-white, that's the boat color.
That's every boat.
Like ever. So based on the location where the bodies were found, a team of 24 investigators from the following places were put together to investigate: the Tampa Police Department, the St. Petersburg Police Department, the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and the Florida Marine Patrol. Something that stuck out in this case, though, was the fact that there wasn't going to be a murder scene to investigate because all three of the women's bodies were found in the water. And on top of that, the women's hotel room and the car were both clean and had no evidence or unusual fingerprints to be found. Once the autopsies were done on the women, the results weren't as concrete as everybody would have hoped for. And that's because the women were in heavy decomposition levels by the time that their bodies were found, just due to being in the salt water. The coroner wasn't able to get any evidence of sexual assault either, though it was still heavily assumed. But the coroner did believe that whoever killed these women had bound, gagged them, and then dropped them in the water to drown. All three of the women had water in their lungs, which meant they were alive when they were thrown into the water and had most likely drowned. I remember seeing somewhere too that, you remember the concrete blocks that were roped to the bodies? They were roped on their necks.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. So I mean, that is like an immediate drowning, but drowning is still like, drowning is one of my biggest fears.
Oh, that's a terrible death. That's horrible.
So one of the things that the investigators did find, though, which was super suspicious to them, you remember the note that was found in the Rogers car that had the handwritten directions? The police found a second note that was written on the back of a map that had directions on how to get back to the hotel. But this handwriting did not match Joe's original letter. So right now, the only clue that the investigators had to go off of was who wrote this note. At one point during the investigation, the police got a phone call from a couple who said there was a man who had offered them a boat ride around the Tampa Bay on the same night that the women had disappeared. After digging more into it, the police were able to track down this man, and it turns out he also owned a blue and white boat. This guy also had a prior criminal record, but the man told the police he had an alibi. He said that he was out that night on his boat with some of his friends, but when he was actually alone with a few of the detectives, he pulled them aside and he told them that he had actually been out the boat that night with his mistress, and he didn't want his wife to find out. The investigators were able to clear his alibi, and they let this guy go.
They talked to the mistress?
Yeah.
So he was cleared.
Yeah. Okay. So now there's no leads to go off of. So the investigators had to really think about what they were going to do next. And it was recommended, obviously, that they look into John Rogers, Hal's brother, to see if he would have been able to organize the murders from his jail cell. Because if you think about it, the women were found with their hands and feet tied. They all had been gagged and assaulted. And that was the exact same scenario that John had put his ex-girlfriend through. But after further investigation, they determined that John did not play a hand in these murders. There was no evidence coming from the jail. As the investigation continued down in Florida, Hal Rogers held his wife and daughter's funeral back in Ohio. And with it being a small town and all, people began spreading rumors that Hal might have actually been involved with the murders. And this was because during the funerals, everyone said he was never seen crying. But in reality, Hal was like in complete shock and he just wasn't able to control his emotions. I always think about that when I hear that in stories that people are like, they didn't cry at the funeral. And I'm like, I don't know if I would, like, I think I would just be in pure shock. I mean, you never know how you're going to act at something like this.
Yeah, and everybody's different. So
Right. Obviously, that didn't stop the town from talking. And of course, the police began to investigate Hal as well. One thing the police immediately saw as a red flag is that Hal had actually posted his brother John's bail of $10,000 after he had been accused of sexually assaulting his daughter, Michelle. So he posted his brother's bail for this sexual assault. But Hal told the investigators that he had actually made a pact with his brother that if he posted his bail, John would sign over his part of the family farm and never contact the rest of the Rogers family again. The investigators also saw that Hal had withdrawn the $7,000 after the women's disappearance, but when he was questioned about that, he stated that he was heading to Florida to investigate the disappearance, but he found out that the bodies had been found and didn't make it out of the state. Fortunately, the police was able to find all of the $7,000 that was taken out of his account. So they were like aware that Hal had not done anything with the money, like paid someone to kill this
Right.
man.
Yeah.
So eventually Hal was cleared. Over time, the case had less and less tips coming in, and there was really no evidence found. So eventually the task force that had been created to investigate ended, and the case was left to the St. Petersburg Police Department. Shortly after, the number of people working on the Rogers family murder case went from 24 people to 2. So like it really went down. But at least they didn't they didn't give up on it. 4 months after the murders in October, the head detective in the case, he received an interesting clue. It was reported of a rape that had occurred on May 15th, which was about 2 weeks before the murders. This rape victim had come forward. She was a 24-year-old woman who was in the area vacationing with one of her girlfriends. The women were at this local 7-Eleven when a man began chatting with them and offered to take them out on his boat the next day. One of the 2 women the next day didn't feel well and decided to stay back as the friend decided to still go on the boat ride. The woman boarded the blue and white boat with the man that morning and had what she considered a pretty good boat ride. Once the woman and the man got back to shore, he offered to take her and her friend later out that night for a booze cruise. The man told the woman that his name was Dave Posner and that he would see them later. But the friend was still not feeling well later in the day, so once again, the same woman decided to go on the booze cruise alone. The woman said the boat ride was once again normal and nothing out of the ordinary, but then the man anchored the boat in the middle of nowhere, and that's when things began to turn. The man's attitude completely changed. He began to get irritated and angry. He started to get closer and closer to the woman and began coming on to her. She immediately rejected him and verbally told him multiple times that she was not interested. He then attacked her, forced himself on top of her, and assaulted her. The entire time, this woman was screaming for help, but because they were out in the middle of nowhere on the water, no one heard her. After the assault took place, the man told the woman to put her clothes back on as he drove them back to the shore. During this time, he grabbed the woman's camera. She had brought a personal camera with her. He threw it into the water. While they were riding back inland, the man started to apologize to the woman for assaulting her. He said he wanted her to actually wait till she reported it to the police, though, because his mother, quote unquote, was sick, and he wanted to tell his mother about it before the cops showed up at their house.
Okay. Yeah. Apology accepted.
Yeah. On a side note, when they were driving back to the shore, the guy was apparently throwing up the entire time as well.
Why?
Probably nerves.
Gotcha.
The woman would later say that because her friend had met and seen the guy before and chose not to go on the boat, potentially saved her life, because the friend would have been able to easily identify the man to police if she had not come back from the boat that day. So obviously the girls go to the police right away and report the assault, and they describe this guy as a white male in his mid-30s. They said he had blonde hair and he was around 5 feet, 10 inches tall and probably weighed about 180 pounds. Also, side note, if you were supposed to describe somebody in height and weight, do you think you could do it?
Absolutely not.
I
No.
don't think I could do it.
No.
It always blows my mind when they're like, he was 6'2" and 175 pounds. And I'm like, how do you know the weight?
Do people's thing where they try to figure out what they are. If they bring in people and they're like, was he more like this or was he more like this? And then they're like, what do you weigh? What do you weigh? You know what I mean?
I think I would have to do that. I'd be like, okay, he's taller than me.
Yeah.
What celebrity does he look like he's mixed with?
Right. It always blows my mind. But so prior to the assault happening, the man had told the women that he lived nearby in a town of Bradenton and that he actually worked for a metals company. The women were also able to describe the man's car. He apparently drove a dark-colored four-wheel drive car that was either a Jeep Cherokee or a Ford Bronco, but they weren't sure. At some point, the police asked this woman to help draw up a composite sketch, and eventually the drawing was released to the public. After the sketch was released, the police department received hundreds of tips on who this man might be, but none of the tips ended up panning out. But there was a woman who thought this man looked familiar, and this woman, who we love, her name is Joanne Steffi. Joanne thought this sketch looked like her neighbor who lived a few doors down in Tampa. This neighbor of hers was a man in his 40s. He was an aluminum contractor. So Joanne always thought this neighbor was kind of weird, and it also didn't help that he looked like this police sketch, and he drove a dark blue Jeep Cherokee. So Joanne cut out the sketch from the local newspaper and put it on her fridge. And one day she decided to tell one of her classmates. Side note, she was at Tampa College taking like an accounting class. She decided to tell one of her classmates about her weird neighbor. This classmate, who she knew, was a sheriff's deputy. He would often come into class in full uniform, and she passed along the information that her neighbor matched the description of this rapist and waited to hear back. But weeks passed and she never heard back from that deputy. She never saw any police cars in the neighborhood. And at some point, the weird neighbor and his family even moved out of their house. Back to our case, it's now 1991, 2 years after the Roger women's murders, and the investigators down in Florida are still trying to figure out who killed the girls. At some point, the investigators contacted the FBI's behavioral science unit in order for a profile of the killer to be put together. I've always thought this was so fascinating, profiles. This is like when the investigators heard the word serial killer for the first time in their case. The FBI profilist said that the murderer was most likely a white male serial killer. He was most likely respected in his community and was above average in intelligence and social skills. This man also enjoyed watching his victims die and would continue to grow in confidence after each murder, making him believe that he will never be caught. They also stated that this man was most likely a local resident. The white and blue boat was his own. With this information, the investigators decided that if they wanted to inform the public more about the suspect, they should. And in order to do so, they really needed the public to get away from the idea that Hal, the dad, was in on these murders. Like, they had already cleared him and people were still like, it's Daddy Hal. So the police back in Ohio gave Hal a polygraph test. Ladies, what do we say about polygraph tests?
No.
School in court, and they're stupid.
Yep. But fortunately, Daddy Hal passed his, and the police went on publicly to state that he was not guilty, he was an innocent man, and that the women's killer was still out there. It's now the spring of 1992, almost 3 years after the women were murdered, and the lead investigator never gave up on this case. He was determined to find the killer because he was also a local Tampa resident himself, and he had a wife and a young daughter, so he was like, this hit home for him. So this investigator once again began tracing down the Rogers women's last movements. He came to believe that whoever had written the directions note left in the Rogers car was most likely the person that had killed the girls. By tracing back the directions, the investigators thought that the Rogers were driving around during the daytime on their final day, and at some point got lost and stopped at a local restaurant or a gas station and asked someone for directions, because no cell phones. And this is when the killer saw them. He approached them, helped them out, wrote down the directions for them, and then mentioned that, hey, you guys want to go on a sunset cruise later? I've got a boat. Right now, this handwritten note is the real only piece of evidence that we have. The police decided to hold a press conference to inform and give the media this piece of paper. They asked for this note to be published in newspapers, shown on TV, posted up around town. I think they even ended up posting it on a billboard. They were really hoping that someone could identify the handwriting and bring justice to the Rogers family. So on May 14th, 1992, back to our girlfriend Joanne, she was reading her local newspaper when she saw the handwritten note. It had been now over 2 years since Joanne had reported about her neighbor to the classmate, and she got a weird feeling all over again about it. So she decided to do some more digging of her own. Joanne contacted one of her neighbors. This neighbor's name is Moselle. And she asked Moselle if the old neighbor who had moved away had ever done any work around her house or ever helped her out with anything. And Moselle said that she had. He had actually come over to her house one day and she had a contract from him, like for some work that he had done from her house. And she knew that she still had that contract somewhere. After finding that handwritten contract, Joanne decided to call the investigators and tell them everything. She told them how she had a weird neighbor a few years ago. He always made her feel uneasy. He fit the original sketch. He drove a blue Jeep Cherokee. He had a blue and white boat. And then she was able to tell him she had a handwritten document from him and that his name was Oba Chandler.
And they're like, we'll look into it.
Yeah, whatever. Not to mention that handwritten contract that the girls had was a perfect match to the directions that were posted in the newspaper. But after the investigators had posted that handwritten notes everywhere, they had ended up receiving hundreds of tips and different handwriting samples, and it was going to be a long time for them to get through all of it. But weeks started to pass, and Joanne and Moselle would call the station, ask for updates, but they kept getting told that no one was able to get over, like, to look at it yet.
You would think that they would filter those handwriting samples by like reliability. You know, like this man drives a white boat, like has a blue and white boat. He's blah, 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 you know, like.
Right. I mean, I guess for them to like really say no to something not matching, it has to go like to a handwriting specialist.
Yeah, I can't imagine those are really like on hand for local police departments.
Right.
I feel like that would take a long time, but I'm saying like, oh, let's push this one to the top of the list because there's a lot of factors. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So the ladies obviously frustrated because it had been weeks and months now. They decided to go in person to the police station. They waited the entire day until they were allowed to speak with the lead investigator. When they did, they showed him the paper that they had found and said they had a match of this guy's handwriting. It was at this point that the investigator sent someone out to Moselle's house to get the original handwritten contract in order to compare it to the evidence note. Once back at the station, the investigators finally realized that they have a new suspect to look at. So let's talk about this dude. His name was Oba Chandler, O-B-A, Joanne and Moselle's quote-unquote weird neighbor. Oba was a 45-year-old man who lived in Daytona Beach. Shout out Daytona, Kylie.
Poor Daytona keeps coming up.
It's just, I mean, you know, it's one of those Florida towns. And like I said before, not only did Oba drive a dark blue Jeep Cherokee, but he also owned a white and blue boat. The house that Oba used to live in, which was by Joanne's, was actually at the end of the neighborhood, and it was located next to a McDonald's. This McDonald's, because this is important, this McDonald's happened to be one of the places the investigators thought that the women had drove off on the highway to get directions from. Like they already had that in their notes. So the paths are kind of crossing.
Yeah.
Not to mention, his house is also only 2 miles from the closest boat ramp. But the investigators became even more sketched out when they were able to finally see a picture of Oba Chandler himself. The picture of Oba was almost a complete copy of the original FBI sketch. So at this point, the police were convinced that they had found their killer. But not to mention, it didn't help that Oba was a career criminal. This guy had been charged for armed robbery, burglary, counterfeiting, kidnapping, and going AWOL while he was in the Marines. Oh, and also public masturbation. Not to mention, he was also the father of 8 kids to 7 different baby mamas. Back when Joanne first saw that sketch and had a thought in her head that it might be her neighbor Oba, Oba saw the news everywhere about the Rogers murders and decided to pack up his family and leave town.
Okay.
He took his family to Port Orange, which is a town near Daytona Beach.
That's where I grew up.
This is happening right before you were born. So in Port Orange, Oba and his family bought a house. This just shows you how shitty he is. They bought a house, but they put the new lease under their 3-year-old daughter's name. I don't even know how that's legal. Like, it's not legal. So, but
it's the 90s.
Yeah.
So after digging into Oba some more, the police were pretty sure that they had found their man, but there wasn't specific evidence yet that they could arrest him on. So what did they do? They sent out a surveillance team. They were able to secure a warrant to place a listening device on Oba's phone and waited to see if they could find something incriminating. Back at the FBI office, the investigators were matching Oba's handwriting from Moselle's contract paper to the note that they found in the Rogers car. And they were able to match some of Oba's fingerprints, which they had in his system because he was a felon, to prints that they found on the note from the car. The investigators even went out to the house of the rape victim, and the woman and her friends were able to identify Oba out of a picture lineup. So it's pretty clear at this point that the police now have enough evidence to go arrest Oba. But at this time, they decided that they would rather arrest him for the rape so that they could still build up more evidence of the murders while he was in custody, which is always a good idea.
Yeah, like just get him behind bars as soon as possible.
This breakthrough in the case was a huge to all of the police departments. And so that task force that was originally on this case, but kind of spread apart, came back together a few years later. Obviously, it was a mix of different people now, but overall, around 40 officers began to patrol Oba's home. They practically always had eyes on him, recording him, watching his house, following him in unmarked cars. And the big arrest day was set for September 17th. On that day, the police were a few hours away from the arrest time when Oba left his house in his car and headed for the highway. The police decided that they weren't going to arrest him right then, but to go and follow him at this point to see if they could find anything else.
If you tell me that they lost this motherfucker, I'm going to be so mad.
An hour or so into following Oba, a huge storm came through the area and they eventually lost sight of him. And then get this, they didn't see him again for days. The cops were convinced that Oba had skipped town or that he was out there committing more murders. About a week passed by before the investigators were finally able to figure out where Oba had gone after he had called his house from a payphone around the Georgia state line. Oba was heading home. He told his wife this. And on September 24th, 1992, the police were able to finally arrest Oba as he pulled into his driveway in Fort Orange. While he was in custody, the investigators were frantically searching for more evidence that would convince a jury Oba was absolutely the man who committed the rape and Rogers murders. This is also, I don't really understand this because this just frustrates me, but at some point, the investigators were able to talk to one of Oba's daughters. She actually had told them that her dad had made some weird statements to her after the Rogers murders had taken place. So this daughter didn't live with Oba. She actually lived in Cincinnati, didn't really have a relationship with her daddy. And one day he just showed up at her house to visit, and he ended up telling her that he was on the run from the police because they thought he had committed a rape and some murders.
Oh, so you're just going to pop into your daughter's house. Cute.
Yeah. And then a few days later, Oba ended up telling the daughter's husband that he had raped and killed 3 women back in Florida and thrown them off of his boat and into the water.
Get the hell out of here.
But these people didn't say anything. Like, they didn't go to the police. That's what frustrates me.
I don't know. If your dad just randomly showed up to your house and said that, would you believe him, or you just think, I need to put this man in the psych ward?
They don't have a relationship. He's a known criminal. So, like, if my dad had arrests and charges and convictions for all those things that I said earlier, I didn't have a relationship with him. He shows up out of the blue, states away, says all that stuff to me and my husband. I'd be like, let's just tell the police. And this is after the murders had happened. So
maybe they're scared because the police lost him.
That's true. Now, I will say, Kylie and I live in Florida. Sometimes there are some really bad storms here but I mean, I'm not excusing it, but you can't see the cars in front of you. It happens at 3 p.m. every day. So at this point, the investigators were able to get the state attorney to call a grand jury hearing. And that's when the grand jury voted to indict Oba Chandler on 3 counts of first-degree murder. Oba's trial began in September of 1994. And during the prosecution's opening statements, they talked about how Oba had lured the Rogers women out to his boat and that he at some point was able to tie them down with concrete blocks, assault them, and then throw them into the water alive, where they would eventually die from drowning. Once the defense team spoke, they said, yes, Oba had met the women. Yes, he had given them directions, but that he had not killed them, and there was no evidence he had done so. The prosecution went on to call over 20 witnesses to the stand on the first day of trial. These witnesses included expert handwriting and fingerprint analysis, the daughter and her husband of Oba's, and even some of Oba's fellow jail inmates, because, get this, it just gets better. Oba had been telling some of his inmate friends that he had sexually assaulted a woman and that the only reason he didn't kill her is because her friend was waiting on the dock. You remember the rape victim?
Yeah.
Her friend was on the dock. So he also told those inmates that if the Roger women hadn't resisted him, he wouldn't be in jail, which I don't get what that means. But like, oh, okay, wait, no, I get it now. If they hadn't resisted him, he probably wouldn't have killed them.
Yeah, so just like let him do what he wants. Okay.
Yeah, cool. He would still be in jail. Another witness that was called to the stand was one of Oba's co-workers back in Florida. This co-worker said that Oba had told him one day, which happened to be the day after the Rogers murders took place, that he had a dinner date the night before with 3 women. Co-worker also said that Oba arrived super late at work the next morning and kept complaining about being tired because he had quote unquote spent the night out on his boat. At some point, the defense called Oba to the stand, and he was their only witness. Of course, Oba denied everything. He said it was all a lie. He was set up, blah, 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 the whole, shenanigans. But during the cross-examination from the prosecution, Oba began to get more angry with each question that they asked, and he slowly started contradicting himself with some of the answers that he gave. After the trial's closing arguments, the jury went in to deliberate. It only took them 5 minutes to come to a decision, but they decided to stay in their room and spend some time calming down because apparently, like during this trial, some of the jury members had gotten really upset over Oba's presence. He was acting really weird, and they were kind of on edge about him. So they just needed to spend some time and calm down before they went back into the courtroom. About an hour later, the jury went back to the courtroom and gave their verdict. And on September 29th, 1994, Oba Chandler was found guilty of the murders of Joe, Christie, and Michelle Rogers. A little over a month later, Oba was sentenced to death by electric chair. But when you're on the death penalty, you wait a long time before they kill you. 10 years later, in 2000, Florida banned the use of the electric chair, as they should. So Oba's conviction was then switched to death by lethal injection. Back in Ohio, Daddy Hal had a hard time overcoming his grief, which I don't blame him at all. And over the years, he had attempted suicide multiple times, but at some point, he decided that he wanted to live for his wife and daughters. Eventually, Hal remarried, and the woman that he remarried was a widower as well, and she had 4 kids. So Hal was able to live out his whole family dream again. As for Oba, he was executed by lethal injection on November 15th, 2011. Oba never took any responsibility for any of the crimes, and he even went as far as to write his last statement before his death and said that the state of Florida was murdering an innocent man. But get this, a few years after Oba's execution in 2014, police actually came forward and said that they had matched Oba's DNA case to a cold case. This cold case was the rape and a murder of a woman who had been killed and strangled to death in Coral Springs, Florida in 1990. Florida eventually named Oba as one of their state's most notorious criminals. And then, just a fun fact at the end, Oba's last words before he was executed were, "Kiss my rosy red ass." And that is the case of the Rogers family murders.
Ugh.
What a piece of shit.
Yeah, that's really sad. I feel so bad for the dad.
Yeah.
I'm sure he's wishing that he would have gone and said no to the boat ride, and not that it's his fault, obviously, but that's,
Back in the day, which, was only a few years before we were born, but that women in particular, and I guess, now, hell no, would any of us do that, or any woman, go out on a boat of a guy you don't know.
Nope.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like times used to be so different. I still think that that's a crazy thing to do, but we know the dangers of everything because we have social media. And also you have to remember too, like you said, they've never been out of the state, they probably only know the people that are in their little hometown and they trust them, and they go out to some, place they've never been, and they think that everybody's safe, just like their home.
It's innocent.
Yeah.
They don't know Florida people.
Yeah, you're right. This is their first time to Florida. They don't know about the Florida man. And with that, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Over My Dead Pod. If you want even more information, including photos of the case, you can check us out on our blog at overmydeadpod.com. Be sure to leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and check us out on social media at overmydeadpod. We will see you next week with another case. Bye.
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 Okay, so you guys want to jump right over into overtime?
Jump right over into overtime.
Gypsy Rose.
Okay.
Gypsy.
Lord, Gypsy, what are you doing, girl?
she gets out of prison. She basically becomes celebrity, quick catch up, right? She has her own reality TV show. She's like on all these talk shows, podcasts. She's an influencer now, whatever. Still married to the guy she was married to in prison.
Right.
Leaves him within a month,
divorces him.
gets with another guy, and then like a couple weeks later announces her pregnancy. And like the timeline doesn't match up. Like we don't know who the baby daddy is. What I wanted to talk about though was this week on Twitter and online, people are like, oh my God, the Gypsy Rose crime scene photos leaked.
Oh, I saw that.
But the thing is, I looked at them and everyone's freaking out and everyone's like turning their back on Gypsy Rose now. Like now they hate her. Those photos have been out since the trial.
I truly feel like because Gypsy Rose got out and became like famous, and I don't understand that. I mean, that's nuts. Like to have her on talk shows and stuff, like she's still a murderer, regardless of what happened. But I feel like maybe people didn't know the extent of her. Like they only knew a little bit of her story, like she was abused, kind of thing. But like, oh no, are you talking about the picture of Dee Dee's body?
Yeah, like that's
been out, like all the blood and everything. Yeah, that's been out, people.
No, I think it's just like the younger generation who only saw that like Hulu TV show.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like people are just more fascinated with her because they've never seen somebody who definitely as a murderer have like such an odd circumstance, and then to get out
and she's young,
live their life. Yeah,
and she's young, and I mean, very famous name. She wasn't in jail for that long, to be honest. Her whole scenario is weird, like you said. Okay, I want to go back to the timeline because she was married in prison, got out, divorced him immediately. 2 weeks later, publicly posts with her new guy. Like 4 weeks after that, posts that she's pregnant. So everybody's like, what? Who's the baby daddy? She went on like Twitter or Instagram. She literally wrote out that she was like, this is the timeline, guys. She was like, this is when we consummated, our love for each other. This is when we conceived the baby inside of me. So like she went on and said like an exact timeline and so the baby's her new boyfriend. But it also makes me think she totally cheated on her now ex-husband.
Oh yeah. The boyfriend that she's with now, she did date before.
Yes, before she got married.
Yeah. So
came back to him.
They have known each other. Have you guys watched any of the documentary, or not documentary, I guess it's the series of her on, is it Lifetime?
No, I didn't know until you guys said it that she has a TV show.
Okay. I don't watch it because I don't know where you watch it. I think it's on Hulu, but it's like you have to have Hulu Premium. Maybe you can sponsor this episode, maybe. I don't know. I want to watch it really bad. I see clips of it on TikTok, and I'm just going to tell you right now, I think Ryan is weird. Weird as hell.
Is Ryan the boyfriend or ex-husband?
Ex-husband.
He looks like her mom in male form.
Yeah. He's constantly trying to make an issue out of nothing, and you can tell that she's so annoyed and just hates his guts every second she has to talk to him. Like they're going on a date together and they're in the car and he's like, Gypsy, why aren't you talking to me? And just little stupid stuff like that. He's always trying to like make an argument out of nothing. I don't know, just watch it. He's just constantly picking at her.
Yeah.
No, I did see one clip because I haven't seen the show either. They're at like a restaurant or something and he was like, oh, are you like texting Ken, the new boyfriend?
He totally knew then.
I think that's why he was so like up her butt.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's fair. That's probably what was going on, but he just annoys me. Like something about him is just so annoying. He's just like, it's just always something about like them being together, probably because he's insecure about them being together because she's cheating on him, but he's constantly like, would you still marry me? Would you still marry me? Like, would you still
Okay, so he's insecure.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. Everybody in the comment section is like, why are we making her famous? Like, this is nuts.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of agree and at the same time not, but yeah.
Like, I want to know the updates, but I also don't want her to be famous.
No, like I wanted the tell-all interviews after she got out of prison, but then like that was enough.
Right.
Yeah.
We don't need to make her famous. That's just, I mean, she's already famous enough for a horrible thing. I get that she was horribly abused as well. I'm not saying she should have done it or shouldn't have done it.
Right.
But
right.
Aftermath, let's not do it. I mean, we're talking about her on the podcast. What are we doing?
We want her on the podcast, Gypsy Rose.
Gypsy Rose, if you're listening to this.
But she shouldn't be famous on this episode.
We love you, Gypsy Rose. No, I mean, we're part of the problem, but we're a murder podcast, so we get to talk about her.